Now, a good morning and a very warm welcome to this second day of this year's conference of the Global Forum on Productivity of the OECD. It's good to see you all back again. I have prepared all kinds of transitions, what we debated yesterday and how that links to today, but I'd rather skip that in order to leave more time for the speakers, whom and that is one of the few announcements I make, I just ask all the speakers to really stick to their timing because, as you've seen yesterday, longer everybody speaks, less we have time to debate. And just another reminder for those who are here, who have not been here yesterday, we use Slido for questions. We also take questions from the audience, of course. The Slido code is at the back of your badge. I don't have the back yet. The badge here that you just show on the back of your badge, and there's also the Wi-Fi code and the hashtag if you use Twitter. A reminder for the journalists in the audience, today's debates, as yesterday, take place under a Chatham House rule, which means you can quote what has been said, but not who has said it. And I think this is pretty much it. So I am happy to introduce Andrew Wicklow, is that? Wyckoff, how to pronounce it. And you will chair this session, and you are, exactly, your title, you're the director of the OECD's STI Directorate, is that correct? STI obviously stands for Science, Technology and Innovation. And the speaker, the keynote speaker for this first session in this morning is Professor John van Reenen. A very warm welcome to you, who is a professor at the London School of Economics. And I would just like you to give both speakers for this session a very warm welcome. And afterwards, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning to all, both of you here physically and those online. It's great to be able to open this session. I just made a deal with John that he gets exactly 45 minutes, so to leave time for Q&A, I'm going to make my introductory remarks very short because his deal was I wouldn't subtract from his time. So it's great to welcome you back. Yesterday we discussed the digital and the green transition, the twin transitions as they're called, and we've seen the crucial role I think that public policies can play in fostering and supporting and maybe leveraging one off the other in these twin transitions. Now, this is particularly appropriate given the considerable funds raised by the European Union under the Next Generation EU program, as well as the large recovery programs implemented in other parts of the world. It's not just the EU, it's really across the OECD. Now, again, it's how to use one to achieve the other. In the same context, boost productivity, which as John will talk about, has been really lackluster since the financial crisis in 2008. Now, this has been the focus of a lot of research at the OECD, particularly at the Global Forum on Productivity, and we've been trying to contribute to this with various papers and analyses, looking at policies that are important to foster innovation at the frontier, policies to promote knowledge diffusion, and thus helping laggard firms catch up, and policies to develop human capital and skills, which we heard about yesterday, which are incredibly important for implementing and using to fulfill to their full purpose many of these technologies. Today, Professor van Reenen will speak about these issues and more as he advocates for a new Marshall Growth Plan. And as someone who works in a building called the George Marshall Building, I find this very exciting. It was the impetus for the OECD and its predecessor, the OEEC. John is the Ronald Coase Chair of the London School of Economics. He's the director of POID, the Program on Innovation Diffusion at LSE, and Digital Fellow at the Initiative for the Digital Economy at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. He's published over 100 papers on many areas of economics in top journals. He's a winner of many prestigious prizes, including the, now I'll mispronounce this, Euro Johansson?
That's pretty good.
Okay. Award and the Arrow Prize in 2011. He's a fellow of the British Academy, the Econometric Society, the NBER, CEPR, and the Society of Labor Economics. In 2017, he was awarded the Order of the British Empire, the OBE, for services to public policy and economics by the Queen. His presentation today is entitled The Case for Growth, Threats and Opportunities, which couldn't be more topical. Without further ado, John, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. If somebody could put my slides up, maybe they're up there. I'll try. Okay, I need the slides. Who's got the slides? I'll just start and then hopefully the slides will appear at some point. Okay, so thanks very much for the opportunity to talk. Here we go, great. So here's what I'm going to say. We all know, we're all here because we know we face these incredible challenges at the moment. So across the OECD, indeed across the world, we have these very severe growth threats arising most recently from recovery from the pandemic due to COVID, and more recently because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, as I'll show you that even before these most recent crises, we have a kind of long run crisis of low productivity growth, which has affected most countries around the world, particularly since the global financial crisis and maybe before. So, I don't want to underestimate these various threats we face, but I think the threats also carry with them the germ of opportunities for trying to return to more sustainable productivity growth. And I think that's a kind of growth that can be both equitable and also environmentally sustainable. I think you need to have those elements together. Without good growth, it's going to be very hard to deal with the other two problems. And how do we get to that improved growth? Well, I'm going to focus on innovation, diffusion of better technologies and management practices, which I think are the key to that. And I'm going to argue that we actually know quite a lot now about what to do. We have a lot of, if you look at the research base, we have a good research base, I think, of helping us think about what to do. We always need more research, but I think we can act now on what we know. And the key thing, I think, is the political will to actually enact those types of policies. So I think we need to draw on the best evidence that some people yesterday were presenting, and there's much more around the world, put them together to form a new plan. I can sometimes call this a Marshall Growth Plan. Think about the situation we had after the Second World War, and to frame this around the missions, the kind of key missions we have around climate, defense, and health. So just to give you a sense of what the threats and opportunities are, or to remind you, if you didn't read reminding. So here's 4 threats and 4 kind of opportunities with examples. So there's this long-run productivity slowdown of growth, particularly since the global financial crisis. And we need, as I've argued, this kind of new kind of plan for growth. And I think these have to be built around policy toolkits, so drawing on the best evidence that we have over what's effective and what works. We have obviously the environmental challenge and climate change, but this gives us an opportunity for kind of directed, clean technical change. We talked a bit about that last night over dinner. And I'm going to give you an example of some work that I've just started doing on looking at the example of solar power and the policies which helped deliver us much cheaper solar power, as mentioned yesterday. Thirdly, around defense, we have the Ukraine crisis. But there's opportunities because, as again, I'll show you some recent work I've been doing and other people have been doing, there's lots of evidence of spillovers from military technology into the civilian sector, which can be very effective. Cryptography, GPS, the internet itself. And I think we need to think about how we improve the ability to spread those technologies around the rest of the economy and also reorganize the way that we procure research and development and defense innovation to do that. Of course, and there's the threat of the health challenge and COVID-19. But again, I think, the experience of how we've dealt with COVID-19 has the opportunity of showing us how we can craft policies to generate new types of technologies. Think about how swiftly the vaccines were created, where there was political will to do that. Okay, so, there's too much stuff in this talk. I'm not going to get through all of it, but let me kind of go ahead and I'll give you a flavor of some of the ideas that we're having. Some of these, actually, if you're interested, are in various papers that I've mentioned, reports, including one recently I did for the European Commission, exactly on these type of issues, which came out last week in SRIP. Okay, productivity. So the big hit, we know, this is just looking at overall growth since 1980. I remember when we had the financial crisis. Just do it here, I suppose. Here was the financial crisis, going to be the worst crisis once in 100 years ever. And of course, 10 years later, we have another one even deeper after COVID. So, incredible shocks to the kind of economy we've had, forecast growth, returning after the most recent crisis, but also not looking fantastic. And as I said, the problem is looking over the longer term, what's happened to productivity growth. So here is measures of total factor productivity growth. This is trying to take out other kinds of things which affect overall GDP per hour, such as capital investments. And if you look at the growth rates, this is the kind of golden period. This is the United States of 25 years of good TFP growth of 2 percentage points an average a year. Then we had the oil crises, the kind of oil shocks. It went down to less than 1%. We had the kind of ICT revolution and the productivity miracle. We thought things were better. And then this is what's happened since the mid-2000s to the eve of the COVID crisis, actually back or worse to what we were during that period. And, if you worry about the US, this is the Euro area, which has had a more, consistent decline. Here's the UK, a bit more like the US, but absolutely atrocious in the last kind of 15 years or so. So, throughout, the different parts of the advanced world, we have this underlying, structural problems of low productivity growth that we have to think about how we deal with it. Now, as Andrew mentioned, there's several ways you could think about it. How do we get to more productivity? There's three kind of drivers of aggregate productivity. One is pushing out the frontier of knowledge. And for OECD countries, unlike developing countries who are near the frontier, this has to be a key part of it. And I'll kind of focus mainly on that part of the talk for time's sake, on how we push the frontier outwards. But let's never forget, and I'll talk a little bit about this, we have to think about we can also catch up to the frontier. There's lots of room for catch-up type of growth, particularly through the diffusion of technology. And there's also room for improved allocation, so having output in the more productive, more efficient, better managed firms. That's also important. So all three things are important. I'm going to focus a bit more on the first than the others for most of the talk. Now, here's part of the challenge, and this comes from some work I published 2 years ago with Nick Bloom, Chad Jones, and Michael Webb. So, underlying some of the slowdown is that ideas are becoming harder to find. So this takes the semiconductor industry. You think this is the most dynamic part of the entire economy, where productivity growth has been something like 35% a year since the early 1970s, and Moore's law is underlying this. So people say, well, yeah, this is the optimistic thing, but so that's the kind of productivity. This is the kind of productivity growth. This green line is the amount of researchers we've had to put in to semiconductors to generate that productivity growth. And that's risen by a kind of factor of 17 or 18 over this time. So yes, you can get good productivity growth, but you have to put more resources into it in order to get that level of productivity growth. And people often say, well, this is very, ideas are going to be hard to find, it's much harder to push the frontier as there's more and more knowledge. That's all true. And does this mean that we should kind of put less money into research? And the answer is the opposite. If we want to have the types of increases of living standards and productivity growth that we've become accustomed to and we can generate, we have to put more resources into it. It's not, we can't keep where we are. We have to actually think of dedicating more resources. And there's lots of possibilities now. The fraction of people who do research is very small. There's lots of opportunities for increasing the rate of growth through more research. Okay, so innovation policies. Why should the government subsidize innovation? I don't need to sell that to this audience. There's multiple market failures, in particular around knowledge spillovers. So the ideas that Andrew gets, I steal ruthlessly. Knowledge is a promiscuous thing. It slips from one place to another, and that means the people who come up with the ideas that are not always the ones who fully benefit from that. So that creates a market failure, and therefore there's a strong incentive to need to have government support for that. There's also lots of frictions in other markets. Financial markets typically don't provide adequate finance because research and innovation is very uncertain and very risky. And the empirical evidence suggests that there is a very strong role for knowledge spillovers, positive knowledge spillovers. So estimates that I've made, or more recently by Ben Jones and Larry Summers in their new book, suggests that the social returns for research and development is something at least, say, 3 to 4 times as large as the private return. And that wedge is the problem, that there's not enough incentives to do research. If you just leave it to the market, you have to have some active type of role for the government in trying to bring the private returns somewhat up to the social returns. So that's easy to say, but how do you do it? So what I tried to do in some work with Nick and Heidi Williams in the Journal of Economic Perspectives was to try and, sometimes called boil the ocean of knowledge and look at the kind of best evidence at the causal impacts of different innovation policies in order to try and figure out what's more or less successful. So we kind of classified a range of policies into judging them on the quality of the evidence, how conclusive it is, what the kind of benefit-cost ratio is, what's the kind of time frame, very important for policymakers, how long does it take between doing the investment in policy and getting the return, and also we looked a bit on the prospective effects on inequality. So I'm not going to go through all this and all the table. We call this a light bulb table. So we like the ideas of the light bulb table. But just to give you a bit of a flavour of it, we look at direct research and development grants. We look at taxation. I'll talk about that briefly. Both R&D tax credits and also patent boxes, which are extremely unsuccessful. So we look at unsuccessful as well as successful policies. And we also look at what you might call supply-side policies to innovation. So how you get more human capital, if you like, into the innovation process. And I'll talk a bit about some of those as we go through, as well as case structural policies around competition. One distinction I think I've tried to make is between what I sometimes call demand versus supply-side policy. So demand-side policies is trying to increase the demand for firms doing research by subsidizing them. And the supply-side policies is about trying to increase the number of actual or potential inventors to create that research. And the demand side is usually quicker, but the supply side takes longer. But the supply side reforms actually have some more traction to them, because one of the problems with just stoking up the demand for R&D is if you don't supply more scientists and engineers and innovators and entrepreneurs, then all you do is kind of increase the cost, and you don't actually increase the volume. So if you just increase demand and supply is inelastic, all you do is increase the price. Great for researchers because our wages go up, not so good for the taxpayer because innovation doesn't go up. So that in the long run, I think these supply-side policies are probably underestimated as policies which could be good for innovation. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so a couple of policies. R&D tax credits, I guess that is probably where there has been the most research done, actually, I'd say, in the area. How do we think about the evidence, just to give you a flavor of this? So one is to think about, is it the case that fiscal incentives increase research and development? And Brodmann Hall has this nice survey this year. Some of the evidence looks at kind of cross-country panel data evidence, so looking at changes at the country level over time. Some of it looks within countries, say across states in the US, like the Wilson paper. Probably the most compelling evidence is when you go to the firm level, and you look at how the incentives vary across firms when new policy is introduced, because often even a national policy will have different effects across different firms. I'll give you one example of that with co-authors like Antoine, who's here in the room. The overall evidence from this suggests that these type of policies do stimulate more research and development. The kind of elasticity, which is usually above 1, that means that a 10% reduction of the cost of R&D due to tax tends to increase the volume of R&D by at least 10%. That's what the kind of elasticity means. That was interesting. Oh, okay, so the clock has come up now on my screen, giving me the countdown. Okay, so now I have to look here to tell you what's going on. Okay, so that says that fiscal incentives seem to increase R&D. Do they increase innovation? R&D is not the same as that's an input. R&D is the input to innovation, not the output. So does it actually increase output? Well, I think there's a real worry here, because maybe if you increase the tax type of subsidies, all firms do is they relabel things they were already doing, like marketing, to be research and development. And of course, that's not what we want. We want actual increased innovation. But there is some evidence, and I'll show you some, that in fact it's not just increasing research and development, which happens when you make the tax system more favorable. You also increase things like patents or productivity or other kinds of measures. So, there's general evidence from the whole tax system and some more specific evidence, this work with Antoine, which tries to look at, in this example, a UK policy. The UK had introduced an R&D tax credit in 2000. In 2008, they reformed the tax credit, and they, as is typical, smaller firms were able to get greater tax subsidies for research and development than larger firms. Then in 2008, the UK government changed the definition of a smaller firm. So, it kind of basically it decreased the thresholds. So say firms which had 300 employees that before 2008 were classified as large firms, but then after 2008, they became classified as small firms. So the firm didn't do anything, but overnight it became a small firm and eligible for this much more generous tax credit. So that's a beautiful kind of natural experiment for the researcher. And what we can do is we can look precisely around that threshold, the threshold between firms which weren't eligible before but became eligible afterwards, compared to firms just above or just below the threshold. And if the policy really had an effect, you would expect to see firms who are just above that threshold to have a very different kind of R&D investment than firms who weren't. So that's called a regression discontinuity design, exploiting these thresholds. And this is what it looks like. So here's where the threshold was. And if you are bigger than this threshold, then you got a less of a R&D tax credit. If you're below the threshold, you suddenly became eligible for a big R&D tax credit. And you see exactly around the threshold a big jump in how much R&D firms do of about £123,000, which is a lot of money. You didn't before this change, you didn't see anything. There was no difference. And the idea is that these firms around here are, is almost identical to this firm. So this is as close to a randomized control trial as you can get. So very big effects from this policy change. And this is at the average of several years after the policy change. That suggests a big effect on R&D. But as I said, R&D is an input. What about the outputs? Here's one output, which is patenting activity, and you see the same thing. Again with a lag. This is a few years afterwards. You see that the patenting activity around that threshold significantly increased just around this new threshold. So again, that's pretty strong evidence that the R&D tax policy increased innovation outputs. But of course, again, you might say, well, this is just the firm itself. Okay, this shows you that you give a firm a subsidy, it does more R&D, it does more patenting, it has higher productivity. But really, the reason we have the policy is not for the firm; it's about the spillover effects to other firms. So what we did is we looked in our data, and we can actually look at firms who are connected to other firms. Are they operating in the same technology class? Are they both doing research in artificial intelligence or antidepressant drugs? And then we looked to see whether, when one firm got more tax credits and did more R&D and got more patents, did this benefit other firms who were close to it in technology space? And the answer is yes. So this is the impact, and it shows you that for technology classes which are close, you see a significant increase in the innovative activity of other firms, not the firms themselves who got the tax credit, but for firms who were close to them who benefited from the spillover of that research. So all this kind of put together, and this is just one example in a much larger literature, suggests that there are these positive causal impacts of the policy. And if you try and put that together in a macroeconomic sense, this is the R&D intensity in the UK. You can see it was on a long decline until the introduction of the tax credits around about here. And although it didn't reverse it, it stopped the decline. And our estimates suggest that R&D is about 13% higher in the UK relative to what it would have been without the introduction of all the tax. This doesn't just look at the single chain. This looks at the entire way in which the tax credit system worked and simulates the results. So that's a kind of important macroeconomic effect from this type of policy. Okay, so that's one type of policy. Let me talk about a supply side policy about human capital supply. And as I said, I think in the long run, this is kind of very attractive because by increasing the supply and the volume of R&D, it can actually help reduce the cost of R&D, indeed help potentially reduce inequality as well, by not stoking up the wages of relatively highly paid people. But then what kind of things can you do? Well, one is by trying to increase the workforce who do science, technology, engineering, and maths. Another is thinking about university resources and incentives in universities. A third is around immigration. There's lots of evidence that a lot of innovation comes from immigrants. So having an open policy towards immigration can be very effective, although of course we know the politics are hard for this. But a fourth thing, and I want to just spend a couple of minutes on this, is what I sometimes call exposure effects, or the lost Einstein and Marie Curie type of effects. And this is the idea that if you look at the pool of inventors, as measured by, say, people who are named in, as inventors on patent documents or in publications. If you look at patents in the US that I've done with Raj Chatty and co-authors, you'd be unsurprised to hear there's relatively few women, relatively few minorities, relatively few kids from low-income backgrounds who are in the inventor pool. And potentially this represents a huge loss of talent. If there's lots of people who could have become Einsteins or Marie Curies, yet just because they were born in they were born as minorities or born in poorer areas, they weren't given the opportunities to flourish and become the entrepreneurs or innovators of the future, then this is a huge loss of talent that we have in a country and around the world. So, we document that, for example, kids born into the poorest 1% of into the richest 1% of parents are 10 times more likely to grow up to be an inventor than those born in the bottom 50%. And hardly any of this is explained by ability. So we have like test scores that these kids had when they were 7 years old or 8 years old, and those things hardly explain any of these, a very small fraction of the difference. So unlocking this hidden talent, we estimate in the paper, could quadruple the overall innovation rate in the US and presumably in Europe and other places. And there are lots of policies which actually can help. I mean, this is an example of policies which could help both growth and also equity, because this is not just a loss of innovation and growth, this is also a growth inequality that people face through lack of opportunities. So, we look at many of the policies around, for example, education. So David Card has, and Giuliano have some nice paper about how policies towards tracking gifted and talented kids can really help minorities in US schools. There's work on looking at other kinds of information exposure policies for women and other kinds of groups to actually encourage them to go and study STEM and go into careers in innovation. So there's lots of things which can be done here. They take a long time, but actually they're not very expensive. So there are actually policies which could be very, very beneficial over the long run, not things we conventionally think of as innovation policies. Okay, talk a little bit about diffusion. There's two aspects of diffusion. I think technology, digital was talked about a lot yesterday. I think that's going to focus on another thing which is less talked about, which is managerial practices. I mean, I have to talk about managerial practices in my job description. So, we've been doing a lot of work on trying to measure this difficult thing called management over the last 15 years or so. So we do this in lots of different ways. The kind of first method that we kind of pioneered was, the radical methodology of talking to people, which was interviewing middle managers in different manufacturing firms, and more recently in schools and hospitals and other kinds of organization, retail stores, and trying to come up with a basic measure of management practices. This is not the highfalutin stuff that I used to teach in a business school, like strategy or pricing. This is much more basic stuff. This is like how you track things happening in your firm and monitoring them, how you try and set sensible targets, how you do good human resources, in terms of promoting people based on effort and ability and not through nepotism, or sensible and careful hiring policies, or dealing with underperformance and so on. So, there's a bunch of ways of trying to measure these things. If you look at the average scores across countries, from now we have about 25,000 different interviews, this ranking looks very much like the productivity distribution. So, unsurprisingly, you see the richer countries on the top, like the US and Germany and Japan. Southern European countries further down, emerging economies like Brazil further down, and African countries near the bottom. So, this is strongly correlated with the kind of productivity measures. Kind of more interestingly for us is that there's massive variation within countries. So, even in a country which has a low score like India compared to the US, there are still, very well-managed Indian firms and very poorly managed American firms. And a lot of the differences in the tail. So in the left tail, there's a lot thinner tail in the US, which suggests a lot, more rigorous selection process of the worst managed firms in the US than India. But massive variation, which we can exploit in order to look at, the effects of different policies and the different drivers of kind of management across different factors. Does it matter? Well, yes. So, in some of our work, we've tried to estimate the role of management explaining productivity gaps, and we estimate, and it varies by country, but we estimate globally management maybe accounts for something like a third of TFP gaps around the world with the US. So, less in developing countries, there's lots of other problems, but in European countries, maybe about half of the difference could be due to management. So it really matters. Again, can you do, what are the policy things? We have policy toolkits also for management practices, both structural changes like strengthening competition, as I mentioned, is one of the important factors, but also the evidence on more direct policies to do with training interventions and other kinds of things. Now, I'd say there's much less evidence on the direct interventions in richer countries, actually, like Europe, than there is in poorer countries, like India. And there's more evidence on the more structural type of things, like competition is very effective, for example, and openness to trade and education. So I think this is an area where there could be a lot more research done. But there is evidence and there is a lot of policy action in this area. Okay, so that's the big thing. That's kind of productivity. Let me talk a little bit about some of the other areas. So climate change is obviously, the major long-run problem that we face as human beings. What are the kind of policies that we can do? Well, as we know, countries want to reduce emissions, but there's massive incentives to free ride off the efforts of other countries. There's always the excuse, well, China's not doing it, so why should we not do it? America's not doing it, so why not we should do it? And that problem is actually very similar to the kind of problem that we face in research and development. So you could say the same thing about innovation or research. You could say, well, why should Europe be doing research? Why don't we just leave it to the Americans to do the research and let them, their taxpayers, pay for the money, or vice versa? So that problem of the free riding problem of policies, I think is really, a deep one. How do you overcome it? Well, you always want somebody else to reduce the emissions or to do the innovation. And of course, how are we going to tackle climate change? Well, we need to, we do need to have better carbon pricing. We do need to have better regulation. But we know that the politics of that are extremely hard. And I don't think we're ever going to get enough of that, as we were discussing last night over dinner, just by those alone. So that means that we do need policies to stimulate clean innovation and diffusion. So how can we do that? Well, there's a lot of evidence that we can do that. So here's some examples of paper, Darren Acemoglu and co-authors looking at clean energy, some work on shale gas that Daron, Philippe Aguillon, and other people in the room like David have been involved with, the work with Antoine, David, and others that we've done on looking at electric cars and fuel prices. So we found that when tax-adjusted fuel prices went up, this gave more incentives to innovate in clean cars and clean electric vehicles relative to dirty vehicles, internal combustion engine. I want to mention one thing. I know this was touched on yesterday by David on solar energy, because I think this is a really interesting story of how policy can come together with tackling climate change. So this is new work with Robin Burgess at LSE. So this, I think you've seen, this is the good news. So this is the kind of rapid falling of the cost of solar energy since the mid-1970s, and it really has been extraordinary. So like $100 per watt back in the mid-70s, now to under 25 cents in 2019. So this has been this massive fall, and in particular, you can see there's this big fall in the kind of 2000s type of period. Now, what underlies this? Well, one of the factors underlying this is the rise of China. So this is the market share of China in photovoltaic cells, which are kind of go into modules for solar panels. And you can see that in 2000, in 2000 the market share of China was like 0, and then by the end of the period it's like almost 60%. So there's been this huge takeoff of China, and this is not just China stealing market share, it's that the aggregate amount of production has kind of exploded around the world, and particularly has exploded in China. Now, there's lots of policies around the world. Part of this was stimulated by German feed-in tariffs in the 2000s, and earlier Japanese, rooftop incentives, and even earlier the R&D in the defense industry that the US had done. But most recently, there's been these big policy efforts towards solar in China. So both through 5-year plans, but also at the local level, lots of different prefectures and cities bringing in policies to kind of subsidize solar power. So what we did is, what we're doing, I should say, is we've put together, we've pulled out from this fantastic PK Law database the different types of solar power policies which have occurred in China at the local level. So this is kind of at the kind of city region level in China, and these lines just track the fraction of cities which have actually introduced some solar policy. So you can see that in 2006 there was basically nothing, but by the end of the period, by today, about 30% of all cities have brought in some explicit solar subsidy policies, and there's a range of other kind of policies as well that China has brought in. So in the paper, we've started focusing on these subsidy policies. Within that, you can look at policies towards demand, stimulating, trying to get more solar energy usage, versus supply, which is the more direct subsidies, which are kind of both on the innovation side, but also on the production side, to get production in cities to go to different areas of China. And our initial results are quite interesting, because if you look at this is just a simple diff and diff type of analysis, exploiting the fact that some city areas have introduced up to 30%. I showed you in the last slide have introduced solar policies, and others haven't. And you can exploit the timing of that. And you can see after the introduction of these policies, there was a huge increase in terms of PV, of solar panels production when these policies were introduced. And I haven't got this up, but we also have evidence that with a lag again, there was more innovation as well afterwards, as measured by patents or productivity. So the production increased, maybe there's some learning by doing effects, there's some more innovation. So these policies do seem to be having an effect, and I think they're part of this broader set of policies which has helped grow the solar energy industry and pull down prices. So, as I said, there's lots of policies around the world that have done this. But part of the more recent policies is Chinese industrial policy, massively increasing supply, lowering prices, and subsidizing innovation. And I guess the interesting thing from the lessons from this is that this may be a policy which both benefited China and benefited the world. I mean, you could argue about it. Clearly it benefited the world by the fall of prices, but maybe it also benefited China itself and Chinese taxpayers by growing the industry themselves. So I think this is an example where a country-specific policy can have local benefits as well as global benefits, and this may help us overcome some of the free rider problems that we face. Now, there may be other issues of competition and dumping, and we can talk about that in Q&A. But I think overall, there may be lessons from this if we think about wind, hydrogen, other forms of climate change technologies, where there can be wins both for the country and also more generally globally. So I think that's one interesting example. Okay, defense. This is the top of all our minds with the Ukraine conflict. As I said, there's a lot of, not as much as R&D tax credits, but there's a lot of evidence that direct government grants can be effective in raising innovation and R&D. And in a way, they're more attractive than just tax policies. The problem with tax policies is that, the companies can choose where they spend the money on, and they may not spend the money on things which create the biggest social spillovers. They'll do things which are in the profit-making interests, but not necessarily in the interests of society. So, having more directed government grants can actually be targeted towards areas. Maybe that's green energy, towards health, but more generally areas which are better for social spillovers. And there is evidence that kind of not all, but well-designed public R&D programs can crowd in innovation on average. So defense is a good example of that, because a lot of the defense spending is driven not by economic concerns, but by geopolitical concerns. So, work that I've done with Enrico Moretti and Claudia Steinwender using kind of defense shocks suggests that these can be quite effective ways of actually both of stimulating more private sector research and development activity. So we looked at that using industry country data from the OECD and also French panel data. There's also Mirko Draker for his PhD also found some evidence of this in the US as well. We found that, on average, about 10% more public R&D stimulates about 5% more private sector R&D in the long run. So that suggests there's a win from this. But we also found, again, in recent work, that it's not just the amount of money you put in, but it's the way you put the money. It's how you structure these kind of R&D procurement. So in some recent work with Sabrina Howell, Jason Rathje from the US Air Force, and Jun Wong, who's a PhD student in Chicago, we've looked at an interesting reform in the US to the way that R&D was procured. So, defense is interesting. The US Department of Defense is the biggest R&D supporting entity in the world. It supplies about 6% of global R&D. It's always had this kind of dual use mandate, and many of the frontier defense technologies have also spilled over, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, into the private sector, GPS, cryptography, and so on. And it's often lauded as an example of mission-oriented industrial policy from case studies like the work of Mazzucato and others. But we show in this paper that all is not well in the US R&D, defense R&D garden, that in fact this slowdown I showed you in terms of R&D productivity, this is even stronger in the defense sector than it has been in other sectors. So although, it was true historically that the US defense sector had a lot of, this high productivity, it seems to have come off the boil. And in response to that, many US policymakers have actually tried to reform the way that they procure R&D. So in particular, the reform we look at is in the Air Force. The conventional approach in one of the programs they took, this is Small Business Innovation Research Program, is that the Air Force would say, okay, we want to have technologies which are very specific. So we want, for example, an affordable, durable, electrically conductive coating or material for silver paint replacements on advanced aircraft. So very tightly specified. And they launch a competition, and people would bid to do this, and then they would select who won and who developed the white paper, then the prototype, and if it was successful, eventually produced it. That's a very top-down, centralized approach. And the reforms trying to build off some of these private sector innovation programs, which are much more open and more bottom-up. So in addition to these competitions, simultaneously they ran what they call the open reform, which was a program where they allowed firms to bid in, but they could say what they thought the Air Force needed in terms of innovation, these unknown unknowns. So they would, like we do for our academic grants, put in a proposal. And luckily we've managed, through Jason's help, to get administrative data on all the applicants to both programs. And in fact, for the conventional program, the centralized program, all the way back, for 20 years. And we got all the applications, the descriptions, the scores that the Department of Defense gave to all the applications. And of course, whether they won or lost, and eventually the outcomes to see what impact they have. So we can do another one of these regression discontinuity designs, looking at the just winners, just losers, to see what the causal impact is of the conventional program, the centralized program, relative to this new program launched in 2018. So it's very remarkable. So here's we have a lot of different things, but here's just one example on, this is on patents, but you can also look at this on the adoption of new technologies in the military or for venture capital funding. They all look very similar to this. So what does this show you? This is just the rank. So these are everybody gets a score in terms of the application. These are the ones who just won. These are the ones who just lost. So you can see that, there's a sudden break. So, the fact you got a score of 49 and somebody else got a score of 50, that's basically the same, they're as good as each other. So that's the kind of idea. And you can see the ones who just won got, in the subsequent 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, were much more likely to have innovated than the ones who just lost for the new open decentralized program. Whereas for the conventional program, there's zero effect. So, the traditional program is a very top-down program. People were getting money, but they weren't actually converting those into new innovations, into new diffusion. They weren't actually getting new contracts. What they were actually doing was just winning more future competitions. So they actually were not, there was this kind of lock-in effect and persistent dominance. So, this suggests to me that, one of the things which the program did was get new types of firms in. They got new ideas, they got smaller firms, more startups. The fact there's all these positive effects, and whereas the conventional program had no effect, suggests to me that having a more decentralized approach to some innovation funding could be very, very important. So, given that we're going to have this big increase in military spending following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some of this has to be, I think, focused on innovation and R&D. And we should also think about how we structure those funds in a way which is a more decentralized to crowdsource new ideas in the same way that the Open program did. And so the DARPA program actually has some similarities to this actually as well. Okay, so I'm getting out of time. I have a section on health. I think the main thing from this is just what I said at the beginning, that the push that we made during the pandemic, where there were huge government resources and private sector resources devoted towards trying to come up with the vaccines and other forms of medical innovations to deal with the pandemic. And we produced not just one vaccine, but multiple vaccines within a 12-month period, shows what can be done if you can get governments and the private sector working together effectively to remove many of the barriers. And those barriers are not just money, they're also like regulations over how you can build manufacturing facilities to produce the vaccines, which were fast-tracked in many countries. There are ways in which you try and get the right kind of incentives and human capital into these things. But that shows you the opportunity, I think, in the medical sphere. And we need to build on that idea in ways of thinking about how to deal with the other crises that we face. Okay, so let me just finish in my last few minutes and talk about what how do we put this into practice, which I think fundamentally is a political challenge. So, I've argued there's these big threats, but also these opportunities for creative policies, that we know a lot about the types of things which can be done. So on the structural side, competition policies, tax policies, trade policies, as well as direct type of interventions. In doing this, we need to think about these policy toolkits, and we need to build them together in a kind of mission. This will be different in different countries. I produced some work for the European Commission recently. We've also produced UK-specific kind of ideas as well as US-specific ideas and so on. But one of the themes which kind of runs through this is that to deal with these type of challenges, these are long-run challenges, any long-run type of plans. And, coming from London yesterday, you realize that, there is a serious problem of what I call policy attention deficit disorder. That the uncertainty, the chaos, the flip-flopping, the inability to think long-term in many countries, which has a lot to do with the lurch to populism around the world, but actually also has deeper roots in terms of the 24/7 media culture that we have, the fact that for these long-run investments there's actually too much political interference. The way we have to think about this is to kind of create new institutions and bolster our existing institutions. So the way I think about this is that we need to have national and international institutions which can kind of lean in against the tendency of policymakers and politicians to constantly tinker and interfere with these type of long-run investment decisions. Now, an example of that is independence of the central banks. We know that in monetary policy, independent competition authorities, fiscal councils, health regulators. We try to argue for this, and some of those policies are being introduced in the UK in infrastructure reforms. So I think the idea is this is not a replacement of democracy. So democracy is about setting the challenges and the frameworks, but in order to deliver those, you need to have some of these kind of institutions. And, they can always be overruled by politicians. Or, a politician can always come in and override a central bank. But what I'm hoping very much is that these can be institutions which can lean in against that kind of risk. And of course, the OECD itself, I think, is an example of an institution which does exactly that, providing independent advice, trying to lean in against the tendency of policymakers to make very short-term decisions. And with that, I will end, and thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
And 1.2 minutes early, so there you go.
No, that was fabulous, and I think you brought together a lot of the different strands of the conversation we were having yesterday, last night at dinner, and then hopefully throughout the day today. Let me encourage, now's the time for questions. We have about 10 12 minutes. Love to, as the mic goes to this gentleman in the middle. Very good, it's right there.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. I'm wondering about innovation policy as regards to patents. On the one hand, the climate crisis is so urgent that you could argue, let's have the government buy up the patents and let everyone have access to the technology in order to adapt climate-friendly policies or climate-friendly technologies as quickly as possible. On the other hand, you do want to keep incentives high to innovate privately as well. Do you have some sort of recommendation on how to balance those two in the best possible way?
Does this work? Oh,
It should, but I think it does now.
okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The short answer is no. I haven't thought enough about that, but I can give you some thoughts. I mean, the patent system is generally a complete, it's a real mess. So, I think there, as we know, there's huge problems. I think that one of the big problems, actually, just more broadly, is that many large firms exploit the patent system as a way of preventing many new entrants from coming in by forming patent thickets. So there's a big, set of competition on the board of competition policy and IP policy to try and reduce the ability of very large companies to do that, which undermines the kind of whole system. On your specific thing on climate change, I don't know enough about the right way to. I would be reluctant to say we should have a whole-scale abrogation of intellectual property of patents relating to innovations which have been developed in the private sector, because as you, I think, mentioned, the incentive effects that creates could have a very chilling effect on the private sector incentives to create new forms of innovation. But I don't think we should be, ashamed if many of those, a lot of the money has come from the public sector to have a condition of getting a lot of public sector funding is that we very swiftly make that information available in the patent system that other people can use. So I think that certainly the sweeping the whole thing away is probably not the right way to do things, but that given that there's extensive government involvement and subsidies, that there should be easier access to the underlying information, and there may be some form of compensation that has to be given if the patent rights are taken away. But we shouldn't think of patent rights as somehow a God-given, unabridgeable thing. There's more important things than intellectual property rights. Climate change, competition policy trumps those at the end of the day.
Good. I think yours works. Other questions? This gentleman. And as the mic goes to you, let me just, no, it's faster than I think. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for the great speech. You argued for the solar industry. You showed the example of China, which had like very direct, targeted subsidies for the solar industry, while for defense, you argued that the more open grants would be beneficial. So I wondered, is for the climate policy, for climate change, we would argue that's a special case. We can argue for more targeted innovation grants, or would you argue also for climate policy we should give grants to one that has the potential to reduce CO2 emissions with the lowest cost?
Yeah, it's a good question. The easy answer is, I suppose, you need to have some mixture of these different policies. I think that in the example of defense, the tradition, and I think this is true in Europe, certainly too, has been in the UK and has in the US, is that it's extremely centralized. So it's like, you understand that because of national security and everything else, that, the government knows best. And it says, we want this particular technology, you just tell us what the different way to produce it is. So I think that, this example of this program shows you that there's potential for much more flexibility to move more towards the kind of open source way of getting ideas. Now that doesn't mean that
everything should be like that. You still need to have some specific types of innovation for specific things. So, this was only one small part of the overall US Department of Defense program. So I think what we'd be arguing for is, in that example, at the margin, to shift, because it was practically zero before, to shift more towards this without going all the way, and then learn as we shift more. Do we actually fund? So another worry, of course, is this is a new program. So maybe, after a while, it'll revert back to the older program. So I think we have to learn. On the China thing, it's interesting. I mean, there's a real mixture of things in China. So China, part of it was building the industry. So it didn't have an industry before, and the series of policies which try to help build the production part of the economy rather than the innovation side of the economy. But increasingly what's happened, and you kind of see this in the data, so if you look at patenting activity, or you look at these competitions that they have on most efficient forms of solar panels. So even like 6 years ago, China won nothing, and now they're winning 20% of all the competitions. So they've moved up that innovation scheme. Now, the innovation type of grants that China is doing, I don't know enough about exactly how they're doing that, and it may well be they have a more open approach that I just don't know. So that certainly is something we should look a bit more at. Thanks,
John. If I could just take the prerogative of the chair and bear down on those two questions a little bit, just because I want to reach the policy lesson. We calculated a long time ago, in 2010, that R&D tax credits, when you calculate the foregone tax revenue, are actually a huge expenditure, or foregone expenditure by governments. And for some governments like Australia and Canada, it dwarfed what they were spending on direct R&D. And we just asked the question, is this the right mix? As we go towards these grand challenges, and as your presentation suggests, let me ask you the question, should governments be reallocating away from R&D tax credits towards more of these direct forms, contracts, grants, and awards that allow a more targeted approach, maybe albeit borrowing some lessons from the Department of Defense on this more open approach?
Yeah, so I've seen, of course, the great OECD work on this, and also, as you say, there has been this general movement over the last 20 or 30 years towards R&D tax credits and away from the more directed type of grants. I always, one macro thing I'd say on this is I really resist the idea that you should reduce in order, it's like a fixed R&D budget, and you have to say, well, I ought to put it in tax credits or in R&D grants. So if I increase R&D grants, I have to reduce tax credit. I mean, that doesn't make any sense from a kind of welfare point of view. I mean, if we think we're underinvesting in R&D, we need to increase the envelope and increase both. So I really would resist the idea that is very strong in policymakers. There's a kind of should be a fixed R&D, but you should be thinking of what's the best policies to do, period. And there's a lot of other really bad policies to think about how. Anyway, so but on your question about the balance, I'm more bullish, I would say, than some of that analysis about the benefits of R&D. That's not a huge amount of money. So in the US, like the amount which goes in the research experiment credit is tiny, it's nothing compared to the direct things. And in the UK as well, it's a pretty small beer compared to the rest of it. So maybe Australia is different. I don't know enough about Australia. So my sense is that you should have a kind of a well-designed, generous R&D tax credit system. But in addition to that, and I think like where the UK is about right. I mean, it's reasonably generous, but I wouldn't be arguing for a lot more, say, in the UK's case, for example. It might be different in other countries' case. But I think that a lot of the new action probably does come from the more directed types of grants, because there I think it is easier to try and get at the things that we want, like green technologies, and just a general tax credit won't be the best way for doing that. So I do think if I thought about new money going into the system, that I would put it more towards the directed type of thing, and of course the supply side stuff I mentioned too.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Two more questions, maybe three. I think Okay, Mark. Or if you're already up there, why don't you let that gentleman go? Go ahead. But if you could keep your questions reasonably succinct and short, because we're running out of time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. James Watson, Business Europe. You referred to a lot of work that really uses patent data as a proxy for innovation, essentially. Now, I appreciate we've got to work with what we've got, but I mean, you've just yourself described the patent system as a real mess. If we look at patent data globally, clearly you've seen these massive increases in Chinese patents. And if you look at the literature, a lot of people saying that certainly the Chinese patents are driven by internal incentives for status and managerial promotion, such like. So to cut it short, the question is really how much confidence do we have that patent data is really a proxy for innovation in the modern digital world, really?
Yeah, I mean, not all innovations are patented, not all patents are innovations. That's absolutely true. But I think there is a lot of signal in the patent information, so I think it's useful. You've got to use it carefully. So I wouldn't just take Chinese patents off the shelf, the reasons you said. If, for example, if you're looking at innovation in China, you can look at patents which are also taken out in the USPTO or the European Patent Office or other patent offices. So I think you have to use them sensibly, as many people are doing. But I think I certainly would encourage everybody to look at other forms of information on innovation, and the Community Innovation Survey is a great opportunity to do that. We have productivity measures, we have other kinds of survey measures of innovation activity. The stuff on defence, for example, we look at the contracts that these firms sign and what's in those contracts. We look at venture capital funding as another. So I think we're actually, Mirko and his team have been involved in this. There's a huge number of new metrics that we can exploit for that. But I think we should try and use many of them. So, maybe I'm guilty as anybody else of overusing patents, but I think that it's just one of a big toolbox that we have now.
Mirko.
Okay. So John, do you think there might be something distinctive going on with regard to venture capital and big tech R&D, right? Because I sometimes get the feeling when in our area of research, we're sort of missing these developments. So I think Amazon is spending about 20 to 25 billion on R&D. I think a lot of that is underpinned by the US tax credit. I think Alphabet is at about 15 billion, and they seem to be running a lot of experimental R&D programs in-house. And then there's kind of massive amounts of investment that's obviously dipped recently in venture capital in the US and Europe, right? And so, do you think that's like this big area of research in kind of very experimental sort of R&D activities that is that something distinctive, right? Or is it just another phase of corporate R&D spending? It's the same as IBM in the 60s, or just generic R&D spending in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I mean, it relates a lot to the kind of the last question. So I think venture capital, in the finance literature, people use this a lot, actually. It's almost their preferred measure of innovation. I mean, I kind of think of that as more innovative startups, the kind of VC funding for startups, but I think that's a quite legitimate, useful thing to use. I think the more broad thing about companies are doing a lot of things, a lot of them won't be captured by formal what they report in their company accounts or to the surveys that the governments do. But I see that part of this intangible capital investment agenda, where people are collecting information on lots of different things that companies are doing, investing in training programs, investing in managerial type of programs, organizational capital, parts of what they're doing in some of their investments in machinery and other things. So I think those are all things which are increasingly being collected and used. I think the key economic issue for me is, obviously if there's a measurement issue, but what is the spillover effects? So many of these things are not obviously things which have a lot of positive spillover effects on other firms. And if that's the case from a public policy point of view, there's no reason why we should be necessarily subsidizing. We're going to measure them perhaps, but not necessarily subsidize them. Whereas I think certainly basic R&D and development, those are things which are more likely to generate the spillovers for which we need to subsidize and have public policy intervention.
Thanks. We started late, so just the last question goes to my colleague, Lila Demou.
Yes, I have a question about, thank you very much for the inspiring lecture. But in your ecosystem, let's say, I see something missing, which is the finance sector, Innovating start by getting access to finance. And I mean, you mentioned grants, now VCs, but we know that this work at a small scale often, especially VC, specific industry. So I'm wondering if you have also think of the role of banks, how to transform the role of bank in order that they better serve innovation and, the financing of intangible. In our research, we push in particular for loan guarantees, as a way to increase the access to finance of intangible, including innovation. So, thanks.
Yeah, I've changed my opinion. I used to be pretty skeptical about the financial constraints arguments, but I'm, maybe the global financial crisis helped me change my mind. But I do think you're right, and there's a lot of evidence actually that if you look at the impact of many of these policies, they're much stronger for small firms than large firms or young firms, which is consistent with the idea that many of these firms are financially constrained. So I do think there's lots of roles for thinking, grants and loans and other things are beneficial there. My view is that one of the biggest things are kind of the barriers to entry that small firms face, which are partly financial, but also are partly non-financial too. For example, if you think about the digital sector, I think that one of the big problems that many small startups and companies face is kind of access to the kind of data which is collected, as Mirko was just mentioning, by the Amazons and the Googles, which makes it very hard for startups to enter the ecosystem because if they want to interoperate, which they do with Microsoft or Facebook or social media companies or search engines, then it's hard for them to do that without that interoperability. And the larger firms have very strong incentives to not let that happen, to maintain their market power. So I think it's like, yes, access to finance, but also access to kind of data is absolutely critical. And that's why we need, as the Commission is doing with the Digital Services Act, as the UK is doing with the Digital Markets Unit, ways of regulating those sectors much, much better to get that interoperability and reduce those barriers to entry, and also prevent the big firms from taking over and stopping the small firms from growing. So there's lots of things around finance, but I actually think that access to data and interoperability, to me, is the critical thing.
With that, let me close this session. Please join me in thanking John for what I thought was a great lecture.
Well, thank you very much, John, for this intense and inspiring talk. I think on behalf of everybody and on behalf of the following speakers, thank you to both of you to stick that exactly to time. This is really like the master of ceremonies dream, of course, that we really end up almost on the second, really. Now, I am personally also curious for the sort of spill over of this talk into the next panel discussion, which I will announce now, which is about reorganizing production for the post-COVID digital area. And therefore, please give, everybody has already joined, please give a very warm welcome to Dirk Pilar, the Deputy Director of the OECD's STI Directorate, who will moderate this session and who has joined us online. Now, Dirk, just a proposal. I guess you will not be able to see very precisely who will raise questions in the audience afterwards. If you agree, I will come up on stage again and take the questions for you.
That sounds good.
Wonderful. So let me also, you're already there and I'm standing in your way. Well, also just another reminder, we use Slido even if this time the iPad didn't work, but if the iPad doesn't work, we display the questions on the screen. Now, Dirk, as participants, you will be joined by Beata Javorcik, is that the right pronunciation? The Chief Economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London, Elke Groten, the head of the EU relations at the Novartis Group based here in Brussels, and the other speakers also joining online, Michael Brennan, the chair of the Australian Productivity Commission, and Swati Dhingra, an associate professor in economics, of course, at the London School of Economics. And without further ado, because I appreciate that much that everybody sticks to timing, so I will make it as short as possible also. Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. Unfortunately, as quite a few people, I caught COVID, so I'm at home in Paris, but good to talk with you and listen. Also great to listen to John van Rijn a second ago. So this panel will really be about thinking a little bit about what is happening around the globalization of productivity of production in the post-COVID area and what it might mean for productivity. And just to give you a little bit of context, I mean, I think already before COVID, we saw that there was a lot of discussion happening about globalization possibly changing. There was discussion about some reshoring happening, probably linked to automation, to technology changing, also to cost patterns changing in some of the main countries that we had outsourced production to, like China, and also that sometimes businesses were trying to bring some production back closer to demand and to markets they were operating in. I think then we had COVID, where a lot of distortions, a lot of things happened, of course. We saw disruptions to supply chains in certain areas, not necessarily, I think there was a lot of resilience of supply chains in many cases, but there were sometimes real demand shocks that happened, particularly with medical equipment and medical materials, but also sometimes lockdowns that had an impact on certain supply chains. I think we also saw a lot of discussions about the fact that yesterday in the session on digitalization, we saw that quite clearly, a lot of new technology coming into play, which also has affected things, and also more and more discussion about strategic autonomy and sort of trying to be more independent. I think a final point here is also the whole discussion about migration. I think Michael Brennan will talk more about that. What happens if you're a country that is a little bit more is isolated almost for 2 years in all of this and what is happening around that. So post-COVID, I think if we can talk about that in my own situation, I'm not sure if we are post-COVID, we still, of course, are dealing with some of these supply side issues. We've seen that China still is facing lockdown problems. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine has added to this. And also, I think the policy discussion has changed where technology independence has become a much more important focus, and strategic independence has become a much more important focus, not only linked to Russia, but also linked to China. I think we're seeing already a little bit, there was a piece in Bloomberg last week that particularly on the US side, manufacturing reshoring is starting to happen, at least from some US companies. And of course, on the services side, this is where more things might seem to move. So I think lots of things happening. And I think what we want to hear in this discussion is at least to hear different perspectives from the speakers on these issues, and also bring it back to productivity in the end. I mean, it's not only a discussion, I think, about global value chains and how they're changing, but also what it might mean for productivity, for policies, and so on. So we have a great panel. I'm not going to do any further introduction because I think our overall moderator has already introduced the speakers briefly. But I do think they bring a very nice complementary perspective to, I think, the discussion that we're going to have. So what I've asked all of them to do is first take only 5 minutes to kick off a little bit and give their own perspective on what is happening from their perspective, what they see as some of the main issues. And then we'll try to go a little bit in a Q&A discussion with all of them. And then in the end, we'll, of course, open up for discussion. So without further ado, I want to follow the order I have, which is Beata Javorcik from the EBRD as our first speaker. She is in Brussels. So Beata, the floor is yours. If you can give your introductory remarks, and then after that we'll go to Michael Brennan as the second speaker.
Thank you very much. I want to kick off the discussion with 3 points. My first point is that relocation of global value chains is happening. We have been talking about increasing resilience of global value chains for the last 2 years. We've had many shocks. There was Fukushima, there was COVID, there was blockage of Suez Canal, but it seemed that companies were treating these shocks still as one-off events that were not worth the investment needed in adjustment. What the war changed is it brought realization that these shocks are not going away. Now, the war itself did not disturb supply chains very much. I mean, there was a bit of an effect on the automotive industry. Ukraine is an exporter of cable harnesses for the automotive industry. But beyond that, actually, in a survey we did in the last couple of weeks, we don't see firms being affected through the supply chains by the war. But the war brought this realization that the shocks are not going away. We also have a zero COVID policy in China. We have increased likelihood of extreme weather events because of climate change. And you already see this in survey data. So for instance, IFO survey from last March showed that a third of German firms were planning to increase diversification of sourcing. The survey we ran in new EU member states and broadly defined European neighborhood showed that about a third of internationally trading firms have added as at least one supplier to their portfolio, and this is supplier of the products they were already importing from somewhere else. So this is happening, and this is an opportunity for the broadly defined European neighborhood. If you look at the structure of German imports from China, there is a huge overlap between what Germany is importing from China and the revealed comparative advantage of Eastern European countries, Western Balkans, North Africa. So there is a chance that these countries, if they increase their export share, that obviously will give incentives for upgrading, for investment in new technologies. They will see increasing productivity through entry of additional firms into exporting. My second point pertains to working from home. You may be surprised to know that even in emerging markets, a large share of people worked from home. They reported being no less productive working from home than their counterparts in advanced economies. More than half of people in emerging markets view working from home as a benefit that's equivalent to at least a 5% salary increase. And this also has implications for productivity. So if a firm in London or a firm in Brussels has crossed the mental threshold of having remote workers, then why not employ somebody from Poland or from Moldova or from Bucharest? And again, this is an opportunity for Eastern Europe to export more services. And I think here, new EU member states will be at an advantage because there is next to no difference in time zones. There is the same data protection regimes, and we heard John talking about data protection as an important factor. And travel is easy. And of course, this will lead to exchange of knowledge that will boost productivity growth in those countries. Then, of course, there is also the direct effect on workers who, thanks to shorter commute, spend more time working. They are presumably less tired if they are not commuting. So in surveys, that's one of the factors that increases productivity when working from home. Working from home will also have implication for geography of cities. I would assume that we are going to see people moving away from large cities, looking for cheaper, larger properties in maybe secondary cities. And here I worry a bit about density of ideas in large cities decreasing, and this having potentially an adverse effect on innovation. My final point pertains to the danger of digital divide. And I'm sure you've heard a lot about this, but one of my favorite examples is statistics on online shopping. In our last transition report, we showed, for instance, that while 90% of people in Britain above age of 15 purchased something online in 2020, the same was true of only about 60% of people in the new EU member states and about a third of people in Western Balkans and Turkey. And when we dug deeper into why people are not shopping online in Turkey and Western Balkans, it wasn't just concerns about payment security, because these can be solved by paying on delivery. The more important reason was the lack of skills. People simply did not know how to do it. And then when you disaggregate the data, you see that people who have university education are much more likely to buy online than people with elementary education. There is a very strong relationship when it comes to income. Richer people buy online, poorer people do not. And this is true of EU, advanced economies. This is true. These relationships are also true in emerging markets, but they are more pronounced in emerging markets. But what particularly caught my attention is the relationship between age and shopping online. In new EU member states, only 30% of people aged 55 and over shop online. That's a much lower share than in Western Europe. And that is a proxy, and this fact that these people have lower ICT skills is also reflected in other data sources, such as OECD surveys of adult skills. And I really worry that these older workers are not going to be able to keep up with technological progress, with changes in the labor market, and they will be pushed out of the labor market. Because what we see in Eastern Europe is that unlike in advanced economies where many people get trained by firms or firms pay for their training outside of firms, this is happening to a much less extent in Eastern Europe. And that's presumably because employers are worried about, if they train their workers, workers will leave and they may emigrate because there is a lot of brain drain. So if firms are not going to train older workers, who will? And if nobody does, that will have negative consequences for countries that are already facing adverse demographic trends. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beata. I think for a very rich introductory set of remarks. I think you've covered quite a few things. Let me immediately move to Michael Brennan. We'll come back to some of the questions around what you were talking about a little bit later on. Michael, welcome. I know it's late in the evening in Canberra, but the floor is yours, please.
No problem. Thank you very much, Dirk, and thanks very much. And apologies that I'm not there in Brussels with you. I had meant to be, and it just wasn't possible in the end. A couple of quick reflections on where we sit from my perspective. In many ways, the effect of the COVID-induced recession has been very different to past recessions in Australia. When the last recession we had here was in the early 1990s, and it had more of that conventional demand side recession dynamic with a big effect on the labour market, which was scarring, and the labour market took around 10 years to fully return to its health. But that effectively the sort of cleansing effect perhaps on the business side, which meant that we did experience a kind of upswing in TFP growth throughout the 1990s. There hasn't really been an obvious sort of reallocative effect of the recession here thus far, but there are a few of these latent forces now that I think are starting to flow through and that are the subject of this panel discussion. The first is the accelerated digital take-up, and that is, as Beata mentioned as well, the most salient one obviously being remote work. Just by way of indication of magnitude, some consultants here in Australia, Alpha Beta, did a bit of work on the extent to which automation had freed up time for the average worker over the last couple of decades. And just using ONET data and tasks within jobs and looking at what had been automated, plausibly, they came to the view that basically over the last 15 years, there'd been on average about 2 hours per week per worker that had been effectively freed up across the economy. Interestingly, 70% of that was tasks within jobs rather than jobs themselves. And when I reflect on that, and I think 2 hours per week, accumulated over 15 years, well, I time my commute to work, it's around 80 minutes a day there and back. So that is the equivalent of 10 years worth of automation benefit to an individual worker, and that's 1 day working 1 day a week from home. So it underscores just how significant that benefit has been. We are, having looked at this a little more sanguine about the impact on cities, at least here in Australia, than Beata's thoughts on it. But there may be some sort of second round effects there. But I think the big unknown is the impact on trade and services, which could have a potentially transformational effect, I think, on productivity, but sourcing services, higher quality, cheaper services from overseas, as well as the opportunity of services exports. There is a significant balance sheet effect, I guess, like other countries, a substantial weakening of the public balance sheet. Our federal government debt is now around 45% of GDP. That's very high by recent Australian standards. But a lot of that took the form of a transfer into household and corporate balance sheets. So there's a strength in private sector balance sheets, potentially pending a bit of asset revaluation now that interest rates are rising. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in a productivity sense now that there's kind of capital to be deployed in private hands. The big issues, I think, here, and I'll finish on these, are the twin effects of the impact on skilled migration. Australia having been a pretty heavy user of skilled migration to fill workforce shortages, a big user of immigration in general. Our average population growth has been in the order of 1.5%, which is high by developed economy standards. And that's roughly equally, in terms of the permanent migration intake, roughly equally apportioned between skilled and the sort of family reunion and refugee type intakes. The borders were closed for the better part of 2 years. I think our labour market is still experiencing the overhang of that. Unlike some other economies where there's been, the great resignation or the disappearance of people out of the labour force, the employment to population ratio is now at record highs, very high rates of participation, but chronic workforce shortages. And that's now starting to be kind of clear across a range of sectors and lead to the clamour around the return of higher levels of skilled migration. I'll return to that a bit in the Q&A session. The other big thing is the call for greater self-reliance, which has been mentioned in the preamble to this panel session. It's kind of happening at two levels. At a firm level, there is survey data to reflect or suggest that many firms are looking to shore up supply certainty by reshoring a degree of production, perhaps reflecting that, to Beata's point, we had underpriced the security of supply before. Of course, they are also trying to do that at a time of significant workforce shortages. So I think that's kind of contributing, if anything, to inflationary pressures on the supply side. And if the survey evidence is to be believed, you would almost come to the view, I think, that just as we may have underpriced supply risk in the past, there is a risk of overshooting in terms of just firm behaviour around reshoring aspects of supply chains. But the broader point too is just the impact that it's had on the policy debate in Australia. Even in Australia, which has benefited hugely from free trade and benefited hugely from the rise of China and other big developments in trade in recent decades, the reduction in protection, the move towards freer trades never really had majority support. This is both COVID, but even prior to COVID, some of the strategic complications that we found ourselves in have really provided a bit of a pretext for a return of a lot of sentiment around the idea that we need to have more production onshore. we had done a bit of work on just testing the proposition about the degree to which our supply chains were vulnerable to concentrated sources of input. And whilst the data is imperfect and it's kind of it's kind of effectively too coarse, the thing that we did find is that when you start with a very broad view, there are about 6,000 products that get imported into Australia in any given year. And if you start to apply some filters, like what proportion of those are coming from a source of concentrated supply, like where we're getting more than 80% of our supply from a single source country, and where that country is the source of more than 50% of global exports, and it's going into a supply chain for an essential good or product, good product or service, and that particular input is really critical to that essential good. You go from about 6,000 products down to about 100 or something, and imports overall in the order of a bit under $200 billion US to something more like sort of 10 billion US maybe of imports that really fit that description. And so I think it is important to go to the point John Van Reenen made towards the end about sort of institutional cleanliness. I think there is a role for a little bit of rigour and transparency to come into this debate around just what precisely is the level of exposure, and can organisations like ours, but other independent organisations, just almost provide or put a bit of a spotlight around where, if anywhere, we really want to focus our attention, because I think otherwise it does become a bit of a pretext for shall we say, a bit of rent-seeking across the board.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's very, very helpful. I do see Swati. I think we've lost her a little bit. I think she's about to come back, but I'll give her a moment. Otherwise, I'll first go to Elke Kroten for the next intervention. Elke, I think you're coming from a business perspective, so it'd be very helpful to hear from you as well. I think particularly also coming from a pharmaceutical industry perspective, to hear a little bit, well, what's happening from your perspective, and what is happening to supply chain. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I find the discussions also this morning very fascinating. So, well, first of all, why am I here? And although I appreciate being invited, I was thinking what could be my most useful contribution to this discussion. So I represent Novartis. Novartis is the #1 company in the market when it comes to innovative medicines, generic and biosimilars in Europe. On top of that, we have a very, how can I say, we have a very global organized supply and manufacturing network. As a company, we have over 50 manufacturing sites, of which 35 are actually located in the European Union. And coming back to research, what was discussed before, as a company, we actually invest on an annual basis 9 billion euros worldwide in R&D, of which 4.4 billion in Europe. So I think that's maybe a good footprint to be aware of when I'm speaking. Maybe the most important figure is that last year in 2021, 766 million people, patients, were actually supported by a treatment delivered by Novartis. So I thought maybe I give some some key points based on 4 different aspects. Production, as you asked for, digital, as it was also in the title. Would like to also take the opportunity with John's speech this morning to say something about research and then on environment. So first of all, the whole situation that we were facing with the pandemic since 2020, beginning 2020, was not only a stress test for healthcare systems and societies, but also for many of the manufacturers of, in our case, medicines. And so although we had our business continuity plans in place and our pandemic preparedness plan, which in our case was the first time it was tested in real life, we basically are very pleased to see that 2.5 years later, we can say that we were able throughout the pandemic to deliver medicines to all patients in need. And when I'm talking about medicines, I'm talking about medicines for COVID patients as well as for non-COVID patients. So our business continuity and preparedness plans are built on resilience and on strategic autonomy. And one of the key points, I referred to it already in the beginning, is, and it was mentioned before, thank you for that, is that a very strong asset of our strategic autonomy is our global presence. So one of the things that we have contributed also with OECD, with the trade team, but also with the European Commission is our experience, our real-time experience, our day-to-day experience, and the value actually of having a global operating network adds a lot to your strategic autonomy. In times like this, you see a lot of politicians looking at issues like mandatory localization, but in our experience, this is actually very counterproductive, and I can explain you why. As mentioned before, in the pandemic and also now with the war situation, what we see is that governments close borders. They put in place export bans and things like that. And only by the collaboration with the European Union, the European Commission especially, we were able to make sure that medicines could continue to cross borders. So there was this green lanes for medicines and some other critical products. We had a lot of collaboration in lifting export bans, both within the Union as well as outside of the Union. So this operation of the global networks is, in our view, the best protection and the best guarantee for having strategic autonomy. Second thing on digital. So, of course, digital was already a key focus for our company long before the pandemic kicked in. However, what we have seen is that with the situation of the pandemic, it has been accelerated actually. And so things that were in the past, because of the fact that we are a very regulated industry, not always possible digital, have made their way to reality. Think about recruiting patients for clinical trials. Think about being more successful, accelerating our development, our research pathways. So digital is very important. In fact, if you look within Novartis, we have about 100 artificial intelligence business cases where we see how we can improve the way we operate and our productivity by including digital in our way of working. What was needed from the policy side is we got a lot of regulatory flexibility. And through the collaboration we had with medicines agencies, but also with politicians, what was always the starting point is we need to together guarantee the same quality, safety, and efficacy standards, but through digital and through regulatory flexibility, gets rid of the red tape, so the bureaucracy that is in the system. Third point on research. So it's true, as was referred to before, that the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector on research led to an unseen success of having these multiple vaccines available. And this was possible because of a very, very open exchange of information, of knowledge. You referred before to patents. So patents is a choice. Companies, researchers have the choice to basically patent their innovations, their inventions. Now, there is a contract with society. If you apply for a patent, it means that you publish all your knowledge. So I just wanted to bring this in because the way that researchers, both in public but in private settings, were able to accelerate and come to these successes was because of this very intense exchange of intellectual property, which is actually the condition to receive a patent on your invention. now seeing that in political discussions like at the World Trade Organization, patents specifically related to these vaccines are being lifted or removed is a very worrying trend, I would say. And I promise to end with environmental. Yes, companies like Novartis are very committed to ESG and to environmental impact. If you look at Europe, Europe comes with this Green Deal, climate. We're doing the investment necessary to significantly reduce our impact on the environment. What we need from policymakers is stick to your timelines. Make sure that you actually incentivize the companies that are doing the investments by not delaying your timelines at the end, as we often see when new legislation is put in place. You need to incentivize the companies that are doing the investment and not to incentivize the companies that are not making the necessary investments. The second thing is the market dynamics needs to follow. A huge part of our medicines portfolio, and I know for other innovative sectors it's the same, is actually purchased via procurement by tendering. Now in our situation for medicines, in these tenders, in this procurement, the only criteria is actually around low price. And so what we are doing is we are working with policymakers and with European institutions to make sure that these tenders and procurements are also taking into account criteria like investments in environmental sustainability, as well as in security of supply and robust manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elke, for, I think, a very interesting perspective from the business side. I'm just looking at Swati, whether she's ready to give a few remarks about, I think, some of the things she's been doing for the Economic Diplomacy Commission at LSE. Swati, do you want to come in?
Sure. Is it okay if I don't put on my camera because
Sure.
the internet seems to be unstable? So sorry about that. Beata talked a little bit earlier about the digital divide, and I'm feeling it right now. So sorry about that. Let me just start with talking a little bit about, and I'll keep it short because I know it's a bit impersonal not having the camera on. Broadly, what the LSE's Economic Diplomacy Commission tried to do was to bring together all sorts of stakeholders, businesses, trade unions, policymakers, academics, to be able to think about what supply chains, what the UK should do, given that we have Brexit and COVID and everything else going on, and also to think about where, sort of after COVID has hit, how that's going to impact supply chains. And I think broadly, the conclusion that came out of a lot of the evidence sessions was that there were already these pre-existing trends that countries were moving away from global cooperation, and there was a breakdown happening in global governance. And what COVID has done is basically exacerbated some of those fragilities, exposed them further, and also shown us how fragile the supply chains can be. So broadly speaking, there were sort of three elements that came out of it. One of the policy recommendations was to think about how supply chains could be stress tested the way the finance people have done with sort of systemically important financial institutions, as well as to think about where that precariousness is coming from in terms of the economic system. And a lot of that was also thinking about what's happening on the labor side, which is to say that much of the reason why there were these pre-existing trends towards globalization was also to do with the political economy of it, that workers felt, or some parts of the country felt that there wasn't enough in there in the globalization barrel for them to sort of benefit from. So there was also a stress on trying to think about how international trade could also account for what might happen to sort of lagging behind regions and workers. Broadly, I think overall, the conclusion that came out of it was that if these issues are not addressed in time, what they would do would be to create more inefficiencies and therefore be a lag on productivity, as well as possibly increase the specter of hostilities that we're starting to already see happen. So I'll stop here with the key point that many of these trends were already there about fragile supply chains, and what the pandemic has done is basically exacerbated them and stressed how important it is to be looking for those solutions.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you also for being short. It helps a little bit. I think what's interesting, we've heard very complementary, but also very similar perspectives to some extent. I think to some extent that one question I wanted to ask, well, is globalization dead? And I think probably we can already conclude from what we've heard is probably not. It is changing though. There are some really interesting changes going on. I think that we heard that from all the different speakers, but also it was interesting to hear from Novartis basically say, well, for us, the resilience really lies in our global presence that helps us. And to hear from Michael Brennan to say, well, in the Australian case, it's also only a limited number of cases where we really see this issue of strategic independence or independency coming up. I wanted to go a little bit to perhaps to ask a little bit to all the speakers a little bit how they see this evolve. I mean, we're in a really dynamic situation. A lot of things are happening, but it's also sometimes good just to hear a little bit from everybody and say, well, where do you think this is going? What are some of the things we need to watch out for here as well? There are risks. We have heard about them a little bit, about perhaps also about governments being too active in this area, letting things not run, or at least be too active in interfering in this process. So I'd like to hear a little bit from all of the speakers about, well, what do you see happening and what do you consider some of the main risks in this area for policy to think about? So Beate, if I can turn to you first.
So I think that globalization is changing, that we have reaped most of the benefits when it comes to relocating production of goods to take advantage of cheap labor. Services are the next frontier. So I expect to see more intense trade in services that will be facilitated by this working from home arrangements. What I worry about is friendshoring, and we have openly policymakers in the US speaking about friendshoring, meaning trading mostly with countries that share the same value. I think that is a very dangerous trend that would undermine the global trading rules enshrined in the WTO. I think this would be very costly, particularly for smaller countries. One of the biggest achievements of the WTO is the dispute resolution mechanism, which prevents small countries from being bullied by large countries. And I think once we undermine WTO, once this is gone, this is not going to be good for smaller players. One of the sort of long-term trends that was facilitated by globalization is the rise of what my co-authors and I call global collaborative patents. These are patents which are undertaken or which are obtained by inventors located in two different countries. So if you look, for instance, at Swiss multinationals, the share of patents they obtain that involve at least one inventor in headquarters and one inventor in a subsidiary, the share of such patents has increased from 10% 40 years ago to 40% now. And moreover, presence of multinational companies in countries which has traditional gender norm has created better employment chances for women. For instance, I've done work on looking at multinationals in Japan, and you see that they employ more women, higher share of females, higher share of female managers, higher share of female directors than firms of comparable size, Japanese firms of comparable size operating in the same industry. Moreover, you see that after foreign acquisitions, the share of female employees goes up. And you also see that multinationals tend to employ more female inventors in countries that have more traditional gender norms. And I think this speaks very much to John was calling missing Marie Curies, right? They are tapping into the talent pool that is neglected by domestic players. And I worry that if globalization is scaled back, that effect will become weaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beate. I think also to bring in the gender element, which we haven't really spoken about that much, but which we know is very important also in all of the work we do. Michael, perhaps I can turn to you next. Perhaps if you can all stick to about 2 to 3 minutes.
I agree with much of what Beata said. I think the challenge around multilateralism is very real, particularly for small open economies, and the risks of reshoring, friendshoring, other types of shoring. There are, I think, great perils in that. My gut feeling, and the optimist in me, feels that the reality is going to have trouble keeping up with the rhetoric. So whilst I think if my observation is any guide, there's an outpouring of sentiment around the need to do more onshore. The reality will be that that's a very high cost solution in most instances. There will be, in terms of shoring up the security of one's own firm's own supply chain, building up some inventory, that's clearly happening to a large extent, but there's a form of self-insurance in that. The ability to diversify suppliers, clearly there's a lot of effort going into that as well. The ability to try and strike some more contingent contracts at times that provide a degree of protection against supply disruption. All of these, there are a range of tools that could be implemented by firms and to an extent by countries. And I think, certainly from where we sit, I think, large-scale reshoring of activity would be a very, very high cost and an inefficient solution. And, I accept that there will be an argument about the potential technology spillovers and productivity spillovers that could come from certain of those activities. But I just think the allocative inefficiency would probably outweigh that if it was done at any great scale. My hope is that multilateralism probably, survives in a pretty healthy form, but just taking some slightly different form.
Thanks, Michael. Very complimentary to what Beata was talking about. And Beata, that was the first time I heard the word friendshoring, by the way. It was interesting to hear that. So perhaps we keep the same order as we just used. Perhaps I will go to Elke next and then Swati. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to stick, but you asked me for some suggestions, so I have many ideas. Let's see. So first of all, I would like to react on the relocation, reshoring issue, and I would like to do it with an example. If you look at the first wave of COVID, there were no vaccines, there were no therapeutics. What there was anti-infectives. Now, the reality is that if you look at anti-infectives, basically, Novartis, and I'm very proud of it, has the last vertically integrated anti-infective production site in Europe, based in Kundl, in Austria. And the reality for us was the reason why a lot of this manufacturing has been moved out, or not only moved out, but also basically non-European companies are winning tenders, and that in that sense, it's not only about low labor costs. It's also because, for the right reasons, by the way, Europe has much more stringent legislation when it comes to environmental sustainability, when it comes to security of supply and things like that. So the reality for us as a company was, before COVID, we had a constant overcapacity. So basically, in tenders, our antibiotics were not chosen by governments, by hospitals, and so on. So that's why I mentioned this, what we call smart procurement. As policymakers, you need to make the right decisions. If you put in place regulations in Europe on environmental sustainability, on security of supply, and so on quality and safety of medicines, then when you are procuring these medicines, you should also take these into account. It doesn't make sense to basically, and I think my colleague from Business Europe can also give examples from other sectors, but it doesn't make sense to put in place the right regulations when it comes to climate and so on. But then when you as governments are procuring products, not taking into account, and basically buy lower priced medicines from regions in the world where these regulations are not in place. So sorry, but I needed to react on that. On your question, what we have learned, I think what is important is to invest invest in innovation and also invest in health. Don't only see health as a cost, but also as an investment actually in society. This long-term perspective is something that is very often missing. The other thing is I have the pleasure to be one of the industry advisors in HERA, which is now set up, which is the Health Emergency Response Agency. And the director, Pierre Delceau, mentioned a few weeks ago when we were together in a panel, how difficult at this moment, while we are still in a COVID situation, how difficult it is actually to get the right infrastructure, the right funding and so on, to basically work on this pandemic preparedness towards the future. So I would say invest long-term in innovation in health, and secondly, also work on this pandemic preparedness or crisis preparedness through collaboration between private and public sector.
Thank you very much, Elke. I think very interesting to hear from you as well about some of the experience from Novartis and what you see happening. Swati, perhaps finally to you.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Dirk. Sorry about this again, but I'll pick up on 2 or 3 points which have been brought up by the other speakers. So just, I think what Beata said, and then what Michael also reiterated, that the fact that multilateralism has taken a backseat is a real sort of cause for concern everywhere because of what it means for the global trading system in terms of the rules that countries comply with. And I think what Beata mentioned afterwards about services rising more over the years, and particularly since the pandemic, that I worry that that's actually it's going to become an even bigger problem for the reason that what you need for services sectors to be able to trade more openly with each other is a much more stronger regulatory cooperation framework, and that's much harder to get than what even the WTO sort of slowly tried to do with just the tariff side. So in that sense, we're headed towards sort of more fragmentation in terms of the rules of the trading system, particularly when it comes to much harder things to do like services. The second element of it is that, of course, the pandemic has made all of us aware of how we need global cooperation on public goods like health, but I worry that the environment for that is still not there, and we know that not much has happened on that front despite sort of big promises in either direction. And that's going to take me to my third point, which is to say, just to give you a sense of an example in terms of where that digital divide and where the fissures that the pandemic has exposed is really going to matter, is that when the digital divide, when things do start moving much more online, when services trade does start to rise a lot more, the people who are going to be able to benefit from it aren't necessarily going to be the sort of lower income people in developing countries or emerging markets that one might expect, that these are opportunities opening up to them. So we did surveys during COVID, and it turns out that in India, the formal sector, which is barely about 10 to 20% of the workforce, almost 90% of them did have some access to working from home facilities. But when it came to the informal sector, which is the vast majority of where people are employed, 80 to 90%, depending on which metric you use, only about 11% actually could do any work from home. So the sorts of divides that we're going to see are just going to get amplified by the technologies that are also available. I'll stop there with those 3 points about how we're headed towards more difficulty in terms of regulatory cooperation and how the divides are basically going to get amplified as a result of what's happened.
Thank you very much. And I think we are hearing a number of things across all of the speakers. I think the issue of divides, which of course came up yesterday and which has been a big theme in the work of the Global Forum on Productivity, is coming back also here. And I think here the development dimension, I think, comes up quite clearly as well. I think perhaps since we're running a little bit out of time, I'm wondering a little bit whether there are questions from the audience. So if somebody in Brussels can help me point to any questions from the floor, if there's any, that would be helpful. I'd like to finish at about 12:40, 12:42 or something like that. So we have about 10 minutes left. So if the moderator can help me.
Yes, I am there.
Great.
Dirk, I stand ready for you. So are there any? There is a first question, John.
John.
If you just could wait for the microphone. so that people online can follow you too. Yeah, but there's people online following, so that's really important for everybody.
So thanks to all the panelists for a great session. I was really taken by something that Beata said at the beginning, which I hadn't really thought of at all. There's an opportunity, as if there's some deglobalization, as China becomes less attractive as a reliable supply chain partner for whatever reason, for parts of Europe and North Africa to take up some of that opportunity. And I was interested to say a little bit more. You think the types of things which were supplied by China could be supplied by other areas of the Baltics, North Africa, and Eastern Europe, and how really viable is that? And if that was viable, why wasn't it being done sooner? Was it simply because wages in China were much cheaper? Because the alternative story I've often heard is that, activity was going out of China anyway because wages were going up and moving to places like Vietnam or lower cost places, but still in Asia or maybe in Bangladesh or something like that. So how realistic is that? Is that over optimism on the EBRD, or is that a really viable alternative kind of industrial strategy?
Thanks, John. Just to say, Beata, if you can be relatively short, we probably have a few other questions. So if we can be 2 minutes or so for different questions. Thanks.
So as long as there is an understanding that diversification costs something, it is viable. Right? So in a sense, countries like Western Balkans or North Africa or perhaps Poland cannot compete with China on cost, but if you realize that resilience is costly and that disruptions to supplies are hurting you and you're willing to pay a bit extra for that, I think this is perfectly viable, because what I mentioned is these countries are already exporting these products and they have revealed comparative advantage in these products.
Thanks, Beata. That was shorter than I expected, but great to be short. So if there are any other questions from the audience.
Excellent. There is one question coming in online, and we'll try to read this out. Why growth shows downward trends despite digitalization and rise in R&D productivity? Does it mean that both factors are company level less important than trade? To whom?
That is a very big question, which is a little bit more linked to the whole discussion on productivity more generally. I do know that Michael Brennan, there is a report coming out from the Productivity Commission, I thought, on productivity more general. Michael, do you want to say something about your view?
Yeah, I might just need the question repeated. I don't know that I can.
Yes.
See
Why?
it.
No, it's not on screen anymore, so I can't read it anymore. If it could come back, yes, that is. Why growth shows downward trend despite digitalization and rise in R&D productivity? Does it mean that both factors are company level less important than trade? At company level less important than trade?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I mean, on the R&D front, in fact, the question for me is in part it goes to the John Van Reenen point, going back to his work with Nick Bloom and Charles Jones and Michael Webb on the research productivity in a way. And I take the point that John made in his presentation that it's not a pretext to say we should do less or we should stop doing it. It actually underscores why we need to do more. But it strikes me that some of the traditional sources of growth, research included in R&D, there are diminishing returns, and that's probably why you can it's not inconsistent to see a world where there's pretty significant R&D activity, but slow productivity growth overall. I cited this stuff just yesterday, actually, because I was talking to some university peak body, and I was trying to tone down a bit of the over-enthusiasm I felt was there around, just saying, well, you can spend extra and you'll get this amazing dividend. And I did try to make the point there are diminishing marginal returns. I mean, on digital, I just think that whilst it's a kind of relatively digital technology, is sort of a mature technology, we probably are still in that bit of the S-shaped adoption curve where, the use and the sort of business models that are made possible by digital technologies, we're still very much in the development phase of that. And I think, I've got some time for the thesis that maybe the full productivity dividend hasn't yet shown through. So I think it might be a bit early to judge the full productivity dividend.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're finding a lot of our work is as well is the whole complementarity between technology and a lot of other assets. I think that also John van Riemen, but also yesterday people were talking about the role of intangibles, the role of skills, the role of organizational capital management that John van Riemen was talking about, those types of things. And of course, all of that needs to come together, which is hard, I think, particularly for firms that are sometimes lagging behind. Are there any further questions in the audience? Because otherwise I will start to wrap up a little bit.
Are there any further questions in the audience? There's Antoine. Can the microphone come here?
I mean,
this will be the final. Yeah, Antoine, please.
Yes.
Antoine, yes.
No, I just wanted to bring in the topic of energy security, fossil fuel independence, and the role of the link with the clean transition, which we discussed yesterday. So it's a very general, question to all panelists if they have, thoughts on what could be the implication and how to, whether these can be there can be synergies or trade-offs between these.
Thanks, Antoine. Anybody want to react to Antoine's question?
So I would say that access to clean energy sources will become a new source of comparative advantage. And I think the carbon border adjustment tax is going to focus minds on that. In the survey we did a few weeks ago, we were asking firms, have you heard about CBAM? Are you aware of it? And it was quite interesting that firms outside of EU in our countries of operation were equally informed about it as firms inside of the EU. Moreover, anecdotal evidence suggests that in countries like Turkey, large firms, exporters are lobbying their government to introduce some sort of emission trading schemes so that they are not disadvantaged on the domestic market when they improve carbon emission intensity for exports.
Thanks, Beata. Anybody else? I think, okay, you have a microphone. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I just, very short, I totally agree with what you say. And I think it's maybe one of the few advantages of the current situation, that it gives a real boost and acceleration to these trends. Coming back to what I said before, I think it's also important that we work together, all the different stakeholders, to make sure that there is an interest to move towards this greener energy and greener technology.
Can I?
Antoine has an answer to that.
Well, it's not an
answer. Another question, follow-up question, perhaps.
It's going to be very brief, Dirk. Don't worry. I mean, we saw from John's presentation this morning that now 80% of solar panels come from China. There's critical minerals that are at the heart of the production of these goods, capital goods that are key for the clean transition. So this is just wanted to add this to. It might be an opportunity, but there are also risks. So that's what I wanted to add.
Thanks, Antoine. I'll think we'll take it as a comment and won't take any further interventions. I want to thank the whole panel for, I think, a very nice and complementary set of interventions and for some really interesting perspectives. I do think we're in an area here where a lot is changing. The Global Forum on Productivity has done work on global value chains in the past, and and trying to link it to productivity, but there is clearly a lot is happening in this area at the moment. So the OECD, I think, more generally, will probably need to do quite a lot more in this area. I also appreciated the point that Michael Brennan made about the need for analysis, for some sort of stepping back a little bit and trying to have a clear look at what is happening. There is some work at the OECD on that at the moment, trying to look at a couple of value chains more generally and go in depth and trying to understand issues linked to resilience and also strategic autonomy. So I think those are important things, I think, also for the forum to continue to think about. But it's clearly this is an area where a lot is happening, I think, around shifting patterns, also about shifting sources of comparative advantage. I think what we just heard about the importance of clean energy, the importance of certain minerals, how resilience itself will become a factor. Those are things I think that are quite interesting to think about, but also what it then might mean for productivity. Because if there's a premium, there's a cost premium linked to making some of those decisions, and probably there's also a premium on a cost perhaps to productivity, at least in the short run, that we might need to look at. So a lot more to do here, but I'm just want to thank everybody for a great panel, and unfortunately those of us online won't be able to join you for lunch, but we'll have our own lunch wherever we are, our dinner, and probably are going to bed in case of Michael. And I just want to thank everybody again, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the forum coming from Paris. So thank you all, and see you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Dirk.
Dirk, thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the audience. And thank you, of course, again to sticking in that exemplary mode to the timing, which allows me to introduce the lunch break now, well deserved. Please be back here at 2:15, I think that is 2:15 for the last session of today on reallocation and mitigating costs. And just a recommendation, if you think you need a coffee to go through the afternoon, take the coffee after lunch right now, because there will not be any other coffee break, but the session is much shorter. The entire afternoon is much shorter than it was yesterday. Enjoy your lunch.